My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm 26 years old. Last Christmas, what I thought would be a quiet family dinner turned into the moment that exposed 20 years of lies and shattered everything I believed about my family. The truth was hiding in plain sight, wrapped in good intentions and buried under years of carefully constructed deceptions. Growing up in our quiet suburban neighborhood outside Phoenix, my childhood appeared picture-perfect from the outside. Our modest ranch house with its well-maintained garden and ceramic tiles that my mother had personally chosen embodied the American dream my parents had worked so hard to achieve. My father, Miguel Martinez, was a respected civil engineer at the city planning department, while my mother, Carmen, worked as a registered nurse at the local hospital. They had both grown up in working-class families and were determined to give their children opportunities they never had. Education wasn't just important in the Martinez household, it was sacred. From the moment I could hold a pencil, my parents made it clear that academic excellence was not optional but expected. Every report card was scrutinized, every test score analyzed, every assignment treated as a stepping stone toward a better future. My father would review our homework with the same attention to detail he brought to city infrastructure projects, while my mother would quiz us on vocabulary words during dinner preparation. Education is the ladder out of poverty, my father would say, his accent still carrying traces of his childhood spent helping his own father in construction work. Nobody can take your knowledge away from you, Mija. That's your real inheritance. My younger sister Sophia and I absorbed these lessons completely. We competed for the highest grades, spent weekends at academic competitions, and filled our summers with educational camps and volunteer work that would look good on college applications. The Martinez children were going to be doctors, lawyers, engineers, professionals who would never worry about making ends meet the way our parents sometimes did. The financial pressure was always there, lurking beneath the surface of our comfortable middle-class existence. I noticed it in small ways. My mother clipping coupons religiously, my father bringing his lunch to work in the same worn thermos every day, the careful way they discussed larger purchases. But they always assured Sophia and me that they had everything under control, especially when it came to our education. "We've been saving for your college since the day you were born," my mother would say whenever I expressed concern about the cost of my pre-med track. "That's what parents do. You just focus on your studies and let us worry about the money." When I received my acceptance letter to the University of Arizona's pre-medical program, my parents threw a celebration that the entire neighborhood seemed to attend. My father made a speech about how proud he was that his daughter would be the first doctor in the Martinez family, how all their sacrifices had been worth it. I remember feeling overwhelmed with gratitude and determination to make them proud. The first 2 years of college went smoothly. I maintained a 3.8 GPA, volunteered at the campus medical clinic, and conducted research with one of my professors. My parents visited regularly, always asking about my grades and my plans for medical school applications. They seemed genuinely excited about my progress, never once indicating that anything was wrong financially. But during my junior year, things began to change in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. My father started working longer hours, taking on weekend projects that he claimed were just temporary. My mother picked up extra shifts at the hospital, sometimes working double shifts back to back. When I asked about it during our weekly phone calls, they insisted everything was fine. "We're just saving up for medical school," my mother would explain. "Those applications fees and interview trips add up, you know." The cracks really started to show during the spring of my junior year. I came home for Easter weekend and noticed that our house felt different. Little things were missing: the expensive coffee maker my mother loved, some of my father's photography equipment, jewelry that my mother used to wear regularly. When I asked about it, they had explanations for everything. "We're just simplifying our lives," my father said when I noticed his camera was gone. All that equipment was just collecting dust anyway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The stress was written on their faces, in the way they jumped when the phone rang, in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. My mother had developed a nervous habit of touching her throat where her gold necklace used to rest, and my father's hands seemed to always be trembling slightly. Then came the night that changed everything. I was studying late in the library when my phone rang. It was Sophia, calling from her dorm at Arizona State, and she was crying. "Jessica, something's wrong with Dad," she sobbed. "Mom called me from the hospital. He collapsed at work. They think it might be his heart." I drove the 3 hours home in a panic, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I arrived at the hospital, I found my mother in the waiting room, still in her scrubs from her own shift, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "He's stable," she said immediately, seeing the terror on my face. "It wasn't a heart attack. The doctors think it was an anxiety attack, brought on by stress." As we sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs waiting for more news, I overheard my parents talking with a hospital financial counselor. Words like payment plan and insurance coverage and outstanding balance drifted through the thin curtain. It was then that I began to understand that our family's financial situation might be far more precarious than I'd ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, as my father recovered, I started noticing more signs. Bills arriving with final notice, stamped in red across the envelopes. My mother staying up late at the kitchen table with a calculator and stacks of papers. The way both my parents would change the subject whenever money came up in conversation. Despite my growing concerns, I threw myself into my medical school applications that fall. I'd been accepted to several programs, with interviews scheduled at prestigious schools across the country. My parents insisted on driving me to each interview, staying in budget motels, and celebrating with inexpensive dinners at chain restaurants afterward. "This is it, Mija," my father would say, his eyes bright with pride and something that might have been desperation. "You're going to be Dr. Jessica Martinez. All our dreams are coming true." When the acceptance letters started arriving, my parents' joy seemed genuine but strained. I'd been accepted to several excellent programs, including my top choice at the University of California, San Francisco. The tuition was substantial, nearly $60,000 per year, but my parents assured me they could handle it. "We've been preparing for this for 20 years, my mother said firmly when I expressed concern about the cost. "Don't you worry about the money. That's not your job." So I didn't worry. I accepted the spot at UCSF, put down my deposit, and prepared for the next chapter of my life. I trusted my parents completely, believed in their careful planning and sacrifice. After all, they'd never let me down before. Medical school was everything I'd hoped for and more challenging than I'd ever imagined. The coursework was intense, the clinical rotations demanding, but I loved every minute of it. I was finally on the path I'd dreamed of since childhood, following in the footsteps of the doctors who had inspired me to pursue medicine in the first place. My parents called regularly, always asking about my classes and rotations, always expressing pride in my accomplishments. But as the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in our conversations. They seemed distracted, stressed in ways they tried to hide. My father's voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before, and my mother often sounded tired beyond what her work schedule could explain. During my second year, I started hearing concerning things from Sophia. She mentioned that our parents had been arguing more, that she'd heard my mother crying on the phone late at night, that my father had been taking on consulting work that kept him away from home on weekends. "I think they're having money problems," Sophia confided during one of our sister calls. But whenever I try to bring it up, they change the subject. I assured her that everything was probably fine, that medical school expenses were just stressing them out temporarily. After all, they'd been planning for this for decades. They wouldn't have encouraged me to pursue such an expensive education if they couldn't afford it. But the signs became harder to ignore. When I came home for Christmas during my second year, our house felt different again. More items had disappeared, and my parents looked older, more worn down than seemed possible in just a few months. Still, they insisted everything was fine and focused all their attention on my stories from medical school. It was during my third year, while I was doing my surgery rotation, that everything finally came to a head. I received a call from the financial aid office at my school informing me that my tuition payment was late. Confused, I called my father immediately. "There must be some mistake," he said, but his voice sounded hollow. "I'll take care of it right away." But the calls kept coming. Payment after payment was late or missed entirely. When I pressed my parents for explanations, they became evasive, making excuses about bank transfers and administrative delays. The stress was affecting my performance in school, making it difficult to concentrate on my studies when I was constantly worried about whether I'd be able to continue my education. Finally, driven by desperation and fear, I made a decision that would change everything. I drove home unannounced one weekend, determined to get to the bottom of what was happening with our family finances. What I discovered was worse than anything I could have imagined. Hidden in my father's desk, I found stacks of bills, credit card statements, and loan documents. The house was in foreclosure. My parents had accumulated massive debt trying to pay for my medical school education. They'd refinanced the house multiple times, maxed out every credit card they could get, and taken out personal loans with devastating interest rates. The truth hit me like a physical blow. My parents hadn't saved for my medical education at all. They'd been borrowing against everything they owned, destroying their financial future to pay for mine. And they'd been hiding it from me for years, letting me believe that my education was funded by careful planning rather than desperate measures. That night, I confronted them with what I'd found. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of my life. "We didn't want you to worry," my mother said through tears. "We didn't want money to stop you from pursuing your dreams." "But we're losing everything," I said, holding up the foreclosure notice. "The house, your retirement, your financial security, all of it." "It's worth it," my father insisted, though his voice cracked with exhaustion. "You're going to be a doctor. You'll be able to take care of yourself, build a good life. That's all we ever wanted." I was devastated. All those years of believing my parents had carefully planned and saved for my education, I'd actually been watching them destroy their lives for my benefit. Every tuition payment had been bought with their security, their peace of mind, their future. The guilt was overwhelming. How could I continue my education knowing it was bankrupting my parents? How could I have been so naive, so trusting, so willfully blind to the signs that had been there all along? I made the hardest decision of my life. I took a leave of absence from medical school. My parents were heartbroken when I told them. They begged me to continue, insisted they could figure something out, that the sacrifice would be worth it in the end. But I couldn't bear the thought of watching them lose everything for my sake. "I can't build my future on the ruins of yours," I told them. "There has to be another way." For the next 8 months, I worked 3 jobs while living at home with my parents. I waitressed at an upscale restaurant downtown, tutored pre-med students in the evenings, and worked overnight shifts at a medical clinic doing administrative work. Every penny I earned went toward helping my parents catch up on their bills and avoid foreclosure. It was exhausting, demoralizing work after years of studying medicine, but it was necessary. Slowly, gradually, we began to dig out from under the mountain of debt that my education had created. My parents stopped the foreclosure proceedings, consolidated some of their loans, and began to breathe a little easier for the first time in years. But the emotional toll was enormous. I felt like I'd lost not just my career path, but my identity. I'd been Jessica Martinez, future doctor, for so long that I didn't know who I was without that goal. The disappointment in my parents' eyes, despite their insistence that they supported my decision, was almost unbearable. Sophia, meanwhile, was struggling with her own guilt. She'd been accepted to graduate school for her master's in education, but knowing what our family had gone through for my medical school, she was afraid to pursue her own dreams. "I can't do to them what medical school did," she told me during one of our late-night conversations. "I can't watch them destroy themselves all over again." It was during this difficult period that I began to understand some uncomfortable truths about our family. My parents' devotion to education, while admirable, had become an obsession that blinded them to practical realities. Their love for Sophia and me had manifested in ways that were ultimately self-destructive, sacrificing their own well-being for our perceived benefit. And I began to realize that I'd been complicit in this dynamic, accepting their sacrifices without questioning the cost, believing that their love meant they could handle anything. I'd been so focused on making them proud that I'd never stopped to consider whether their support was sustainable. As Christmas approached that year, the thought of facing our extended family filled me with dread. How could I explain why I wasn't in medical school anymore? How could I face the relatives who had been so proud of the future Dr. Martinez? The shame felt overwhelming. But my Aunt Rosa, my mother's sister, had been calling all month insisting that we come to her annual Christmas dinner. She'd been hosting these gatherings for 15 years, bringing together our sprawling extended family for a feast that lasted well into the evening. "We need some normalcy," my mother finally said when I suggested we skip it this year. "We need to be around family, even if it's difficult." So we went, driving to Aunt Rosa's house in Scottsdale on Christmas Eve, all of us dreading the inevitable questions about my career and future plans. The house was decorated festively, filled with the sounds of children playing and adults catching up on the year's events. I'd barely made it through the front door when the interrogation began. "Jessica," called my cousin Maria, who is finishing her PhD in literature. "How's medical school? When do you graduate?" "Oh, I said vaguely, still working on it." My uncle Fernando clapped me on the shoulder. "We're so proud of you, Mija. The first doctor in the family. Your parents must be over the moon." I smiled weakly and excused myself to help in the kitchen, but there was no escape from the attention. Everyone wanted to know about my studies, my clinical rotations, my plans for residency. With each question, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Dinner was an elaborate affair, with Aunt Rosa's famous tamales, my grandmother's rice and beans, and enough food to feed twice as many people as were present. As we settled around the extended table, the conversation naturally turned to family updates and achievements. "Our Jessica is almost done with medical school," my father announced when Aunt Rosa asked for updates on everyone. I saw my mother squeeze his hand under the table, a warning to be careful. "That's wonderful."
Aunt Rosa beamed.
"Medical school is so expensive these days. Good thing you two were smart enough to save up for it." The table went quiet. My father's face went pale, and my mother suddenly became very interested in her plate. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "What's savings?" I asked quietly, my voice barely audible over the sudden silence. Aunt Rosa looked confused, glancing between my parents and me. "Your college fund, dear. Your parents have been talking about Jessica's medical school fund for years. How they'd been saving since she was born." "We never had a fund," I said, louder now, my voice shaking. "They've been borrowing money, going into debt, almost losing the house to pay for my education." The silence that followed was deafening. Every conversation at the table stopped. Even the children seemed to sense the tension and grew quiet. Aunt Rosa's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something that looked like recognition. "Miguel," she said slowly, looking at my father. "Is this true?" My father's hands were trembling as he set down his fork. "Rosa, this isn't the place." "How long?" Aunt Rosa interrupted, her voice sharp. "How long have you been lying to us about having money saved for Jessica's education?" "We weren't lying," my mother said desperately. We didn't want everyone to worry." But Aunt Rosa wasn't finished. "Miguel, do you remember what you told me 3 years ago when I offered to help pay for Jessica's medical school? You said you had it covered, that you'd been planning for this her whole life." My father looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "I thought we could handle it. I thought if I worked hard enough, took on enough projects." "You turned down help because of your pride," Aunt Rosa said, her voice a mixture of anger and sadness. "You let your family struggle when there were people who wanted to help." That's when the real story started to come out. As my relatives began talking, a picture emerged that I'd never seen before. Our family wasn't as isolated as I'd always believed. My Aunt Rosa and Uncle Fernando were both successful business owners. My grandmother had life insurance money that she'd been wanting to use to help with educational expenses. Several of my cousins had offered over the years to contribute to a family fund for college expenses. But my parents, in their pride and desire to handle everything themselves, had turned down every offer of help. They created this narrative of being self-sufficient, of having everything under control, while secretly destroying their financial lives to maintain the illusion. "We just wanted to provide for our children ourselves," my father said, his voice breaking. "We didn't want to be a burden on anyone." "But you became a burden anyway," my cousin Louise said gently. On each other, on Jessica. And you prevented us from being the family we wanted to be, one that helps each other. As the truth continued to unfold, I learned about conversation after conversation where relatives had offered assistance that my parents had politely declined. Offers to pay for textbooks, to help with living expenses, to contribute to a family education fund that could have made my medical school affordable without the devastating debt. My grandmother, who had been silent through most of this revelation, finally spoke up. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Miguel, Carmen," she said, using my parents' names with the authority that only a matriarch can wield. "You robbed us of a chance to help our family. You robbed Jessica of an education without stress. And you robbed yourselves of the support you needed." The weight of her words settled over the table. My parents looked stricken, my relatives sad and frustrated, and I felt a complex mixture of anger, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked my parents, my voice thick with emotion. "Why did you let me believe you had it all figured out?" "We thought we could make it work," my mother whispered. "We thought if we just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, we could give you everything you deserved." "But I never needed everything," I said. "I needed honesty. I needed to know what our reality was so I could make informed decisions." Aunt Rosa reached across the table to take my hand. "Jessica, what do you want to do now? About medical school, I mean." It was the question I'd been avoiding for months. What did I want? Not what my parents wanted for me, not what I thought I was supposed to want, but what I actually wanted for myself. "I want to finish," I admitted. "I love medicine. I love learning about the human body, about healing, about helping people. But I want to do it in a way that doesn't destroy my family." "Then let us help," Uncle Fernando said simply. "Let the family be a family." What followed was the most honest conversation our family had ever had. My relatives offered specific, concrete help. Aunt Rosa could contribute a significant amount toward my remaining tuition. Uncle Fernando could provide low-interest loans that would be manageable for my parents to repay. My grandmother wanted to use some of her savings for educational expenses, something she'd been trying to do for years. "We'll create a real family education fund," my cousin Maria suggested. "Not just for Jessica, but for Sophia too, and for the next generation. Something transparent, sustainable, supportive." But perhaps most importantly, they insisted on honesty moving forward. No more pride-driven refusals of help. No more suffering in silence. No more pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. "Family means we take care of each other," my grandmother said. "That's what family is for." As we talked late into the evening, creating plans and discussing logistics, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for my own future, but hope for my family's relationships, for our ability to support each other honestly and sustainably. My parents were resistant at first, their pride making it difficult to accept help even after everything that had happened. But as my relatives shared their own stories of times when they needed and received family support, my parents began to understand that accepting help wasn't a sign of failure, it was what family was for. 3 months later, I returned to medical school. The financial pressure was manageable now, spread across multiple family members who could afford their contributions without hardship. But more importantly, the emotional pressure was gone. I was pursuing my dream with the open, honest support of my entire family. My parents also began attending financial counseling, learning to manage money more effectively, and to communicate about financial stress rather than hiding it. They started a small consulting business together, using my father's engineering expertise and my mother's organizational skills to provide services to local businesses. Sophia decided to pursue her master's degree as well, with the family fund helping to make it affordable. But this time, everything was transparent. We all knew exactly how much money was available, who was contributing what, and what the realistic expectations were. The most significant change, though, was in our family relationships. The crisis had forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about communication, pride, and the difference between helping and enabling. We began having regular family meetings where financial concerns, career decisions, and major life changes were discussed openly. My parents learned to accept help gracefully and to ask for support before crises developed. My siblings and I learned to pay attention to signs of stress in our family members and to offer assistance proactively. And our extended family became more actively involved in supporting each other's goals and dreams. Looking back on that Christmas dinner now, 2 years later, I recognize it as one of the most important nights of my life. It was the night our family stopped pretending and started being real with each other. It was painful, embarrassing, and difficult, but it was also the beginning of more authentic relationships built on honesty rather than pride. I'm now in my final year of medical school, with residency applications submitted and interviews scheduled. My parents are financially stable, though still working to rebuild their savings. Sophia is thriving in her graduate program, and our extended family has grown closer than ever, united by the experience of supporting each other through a crisis. The lesson I've learned is that love without honesty can be as destructive as it is well-intentioned. My parents' desire to provide for me came from a place of deep love, but their unwillingness to be vulnerable about their limitations nearly destroyed our family. Similarly, my acceptance of their sacrifices without questioning the cost was a form of willful blindness that enabled unsustainable behavior. True family support requires transparency about resources, limitations, and realistic expectations. It requires swallowing pride and accepting help when it's offered. And it requires ongoing communication about changing circumstances rather than suffering in silence until crisis forces revelation. Last Christmas, we gathered again at Aunt Rose's house. But this time, when someone asked about my medical school progress, the conversation was honest and open. We talked about the family fund, about the support system we'd built, about the lessons we'd learned about asking for and offering help. My father made a toast that night that brought tears to my eyes. To family, he said, raising his glass. Not just the family that suffers together in silence, but the family that thrives together in truth. As I finish my medical training and prepare to begin my career as a physician, I carry with me not just the knowledge I've gained from textbooks and clinical experience, but the wisdom that came from my family's crisis. I've learned that healing isn't just about treating diseases. It's about creating honest, sustainable relationships that can weather difficulties without falling apart. The little girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor is about to achieve that goal. But she's doing it as part of a family that learned to be honest about their limitations and generous with their support. And that, I think, is the real success story. If you've ever experienced a family crisis that ultimately brought you closer together, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Sometimes the most difficult conversations lead to the strongest relationships. Remember to like this video if my story resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about family, resilience, and the power of honesty, and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom. Thank you for listening, and remember, family isn't just about sharing the same blood. It's about being willing to share the truth, even when it's difficult. The months following that revelatory Christmas dinner were a whirlwind of change, healing, and rebuilding. As winter turned to spring, our family began the difficult work of reconstructing relationships that had been damaged by years of well-intentioned deception. The first major challenge came when I had to officially re-enroll in medical school. The financial aid office at UCSF required extensive documentation of my family's financial situation, and for the first time in my life, my parents had to be completely transparent about their income, debts, and assets. Sitting in that sterile office, watching my father fumble through bank statements and loan documents while my mother wiped away tears of shame, I realized how much courage it had taken for them to finally accept help. Dr. Patricia Williams, the financial aid counselor, reviewed our paperwork with professional compassion. She'd clearly seen families in similar situations before. "It's more common than you might think," she told us gently. "Parents who love their children so much they're willing to sacrifice everything for their education. The good news is that with your family's support system now in place, we can create a sustainable payment plan." The family education fund that my relatives had proposed at Christmas became a reality by March. Aunt Rosa, true to her word, had contributed a substantial sum up front. Uncle Fernando had structured low-interest loans that my parents could manage alongside their regular income. My grandmother had insisted on paying for my books and clinical supplies for the remainder of my education. But perhaps the most meaningful contribution came from an unexpected source. My cousin Luis, who is only 2 years older than me and working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. He offered to pay for my board exam fees and residency application costs. When I was applying for jobs after college, he explained during one of our family Zoom calls, Aunt Carmen helped me buy interview clothes when my parents couldn't afford them. She never mentioned it to anyone, never made me feel bad about needing help. This is just paying it forward. I learned that my mother had quietly helped various family members over the years, paying for my cousin's interview outfit, contributing to my nephew's school supplies, helping my grandmother with medical bills. The irony was painful. My parents had been generous with others while destroying themselves trying to provide for their own children. Returning to medical school in the fall felt surreal. My classmates welcomed me back warmly, though I struggled with how much to explain about my extended absence. I'd crafted a simple explanation about family financial restructuring, which was truthful, if not comprehensive. Dr. Sarah Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, my academic advisor, called me into her office during my first week back. Jessica, I want you to know that taking time off to help your family shows exactly the kind of character we want in physicians, she said. Medicine isn't just about academic knowledge. It's about understanding sacrifice, family dynamics, and the real-world pressures that affect people's health decisions. Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. For months, I'd felt like a failure for not completing medical school on the traditional timeline. Her perspective helped me see my experience as valuable preparation for understanding my future patients' lives. The academic work felt different this time around. Having worked multiple jobs and experienced real financial stress, I had a deeper appreciation for what I was learning. When we studied health disparities and the social determinants of health, I understood viscerally how financial pressure could impact medical decision-making. When we learned about family systems in our psychiatry rotation, I could draw on my own experience of how family dynamics could both support and undermine individual well-being. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve throughout that year. The weekly family dinners we'd instituted after Christmas became a sacred time for honest communication. We talked about everything: money, career stress, relationship concerns, future plans. It was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was real in a way our previous conversations had never been. One evening in November, almost a year after the Christmas revelation, my father brought up something that had been weighing on him. "Jessica, I need to apologize for something I haven't addressed," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's not just that we hid our financial situation from you. We also put pressure on you to pursue medicine without ever asking if it was what you truly wanted." The comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "We were so focused on our dreams for you, the prestige, the financial security, the respect that comes with being a doctor, that we never really asked if those were your dreams too," my mother added. "We just assumed." I sat with their words for a moment, considering. "But I do love medicine," I said finally. I think I do. It's hard to separate what I want from what you wanted for me, but when I'm in the hospital, when I'm learning about disease processes and patient care, it feels right." "But is it right because you love it, or because you've been told your whole life that it's what you should love?" my father asked gently. It was a question I'd been avoiding, even in my own mind. Had I ever really chosen medicine, or had I simply accepted it as my destiny from such an early age that I'd never considered alternatives? "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm committed now. I've invested too much, we've all invested too much, to change course." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into trouble in the first place," my mother said with a sad smile. "The sunk cost fallacy. Just because we've invested in something doesn't mean we have to continue if it's not right." Sophia, who had been quietly listening to this conversation, finally spoke up. "Jessica, can I tell you something? When you took that leave of absence from medical school, you seemed lighter, like you were breathing easier for the first time in years." Her observation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Those months of working multiple jobs had been exhausting and demoralizing, but they'd also been freeing in some ways. I hadn't felt the constant pressure to maintain perfect grades, to compete with brilliant classmates, to prove myself worthy of the sacrifices being made for my education. "But that doesn't mean medicine isn't right for me," I protested. Maybe I just needed to understand the real cost of my education. Maybe, my father agreed. Or maybe you need to give yourself permission to explore what you actually want, separate from what we've all assumed you should want. That conversation planted a seed of doubt that grew over the following months. I found myself paying closer attention to my reactions during different rotations, noting which specialties energized me and which felt like obligations. I started having coffee with physicians in various fields, asking them not just about their work, but about how they'd chosen their paths. It was during my pediatrics rotation that I had a breakthrough. I was working with Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a pediatrician who specialized in working with underserved communities. Watching her interact with families, seeing how she addressed not just medical issues but social and economic factors affecting children's health, I felt a spark of genuine excitement. You know, Dr. Gonzalez said to me one afternoon, "You have a natural ability to connect with families in crisis. Have you considered family medicine or pediatrics?" I always thought I'd go into surgery. I replied automatically, then stopped. Actually, I'm not sure why I thought that. It's what I've been saying for years, but I've never really examined why. Surgery is prestigious, she observed. High-earning, respected, challenging. But is it what makes you feel alive? Her question echoed my father's from months earlier. What did make me feel alive? When had I felt most engaged and energized during my medical training? The answer, when I was honest with myself, wasn't in the operating room. It was in moments like this, talking with families, helping them navigate complex medical and social systems, addressing the whole person rather than just the disease. It was in my psychiatry rotation, where I'd learned about the intersection of mental health and family dynamics. It was in my community health experiences, where I'd seen how social determinants affected health outcomes. That night, I called my parents and asked if we could have a family meeting the next weekend. I needed to share what I was discovering about myself and my career goals, and I wanted their input, honest input, not just automatic support. The conversation was one of the most important we'd ever had. I explained my growing interest in family medicine or pediatrics, specialties that were meaningful but less financially lucrative than surgery. I talked about my desire to work with underserved communities, to address health disparities, to integrate mental health support into primary care. The earning potential is lower, I said honestly. If the goal was to quickly repay everything the family has invested in my education, surgery would be smarter financially. My parents exchanged one of their looks, but this time it was different, not secretive or worried, but communicative in the way of couples who have learned to share their thoughts openly. "Jessica," my mother said finally, "we need you to understand something. The money we invested, the money the family invested, wasn't a loan that needs to be repaid as quickly as possible. It was an investment in your happiness and fulfillment. If you become a family physician serving low-income communities and you're passionate about your work, then every penny was well spent," my father added. "We don't need you to become wealthy to justify our support." "But I want to contribute back to the family," I protested. "I want to help Sophia with her education, and I want to make sure you and Mom can rebuild your retirement savings." "You'll contribute by being happy and fulfilled," my grandmother interjected. We'd added her to the video call, and her voice carried the wisdom of her 8 decades. "You'll contribute by raising your own children with honesty and financial wisdom. You'll contribute by serving your community. Money isn't the only way to give back." Sophia nodded emphatically. "Jessica, I don't want your career choices to be driven by guilt about my education costs. We have a family system now that can support both of us without anyone sacrificing their dreams." It was a profound shift from thinking about my career in terms of financial obligation to thinking about it in terms of personal fulfillment and service. For the first time since I'd started medical school, I felt truly free to choose my path based on my interests and values rather than external pressures. I changed my focus to family medicine with a concentration in community health. The decision felt right in a way that surgery never had. My grades actually improved because I was studying subjects that genuinely interested me rather than forcing myself through material I thought I should master. During my family medicine rotations, I worked with Dr. Jennifer Adams, a physician who had established a practice specifically serving Spanish-speaking immigrant families. Watching her navigate language barriers, cultural differences, and complex social situations while providing excellent medical care, I knew I'd found my calling. Have you thought about doing a residency in family medicine with a focus on underserved populations? She asked me one day. I have, I admitted. But I'm worried about the financial implications. My family has sacrificed a lot for my education. Dr. Adams smiled. Let me tell you something about serving underserved communities. Yes, the pay is often lower than private practice. But there are loan forgiveness programs, community health center positions with competitive salaries, and grant opportunities for physicians who commit to serving these populations. You can have a meaningful career and financial stability. She was right. As I researched residency programs and career paths, I discovered numerous opportunities for physicians committed to community service. The National Health Service Corps offered loan repayment in exchange for service in underserved areas. Community health centers provided competitive salaries and excellent benefits. Academic medical centers offered teaching positions that combined clinical work with research and education. More importantly, I realized that financial success didn't have to mean maximizing income. It could mean finding sustainable, fulfilling work that allowed me to serve others while supporting myself and contributing to my family's well-being. As my final year of medical school progressed, I applied for family medicine residency programs with strong community health components. The application process was stressful, but it was a different kind of stress than I'd experienced before, the stress of pursuing something I genuinely wanted rather than something I felt obligated to pursue. When the match results came out in March, I learned I'd been accepted to my top choice, a family medicine residency at the University of New Mexico with rotations in rural and urban underserved communities. The program included opportunities for advocacy training, community health research, and language immersion to better serve Spanish-speaking patients. My parents' pride was genuine and deep when I shared the news. But it was different from the pride they'd expressed when I was accepted to medical school originally. This pride was less about prestige and more about seeing me pursue work that aligned with my values and interests. "I'm proud of the doctor you're becoming," my father said, tears in his eyes. "Not because of what specialty you chose or how much money you'll make, but because you're choosing to use your skills to help people who need it most." The graduation ceremony that spring was emotional for our entire family. As I walked across the stage to receive my MD degree, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, not just the academic journey, but the personal and family journey that had taught me about honesty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of success. My graduation speech, which I'd been selected to give as a representative of my class, focused on the theme of authentic success. We're graduating into a profession that offers many measures of success: income, prestige, research achievements, leadership positions. All of these have value. But I've learned that the most important success is alignment. When our work aligns with our values, when our choices align with our authentic selves, and when our individual success aligns with the well-being of our families and communities. After the ceremony, our extended family gathered for a celebration dinner. Aunt Rosa had reserved a private room at a nice restaurant, and as we sat around the table, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the support system that had made this moment possible. Uncle Fernando made a toast to Jessica, who taught us all that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of wisdom. And to our family, who learned that love means supporting each other's authentic dreams, not just our assumptions about what those dreams should be. As I begin my residency this summer, I carry with me the lessons learned from my family's financial crisis and recovery. I've learned that transparency about limitations creates stronger relationships than false assurances about having everything under control. I've learned that pride can be as destructive as any external obstacle. And I've learned that true support means helping people pursue their authentic goals, not the goals we think they should have. My parents have rebuilt their financial stability, though they're still working to restore their retirement savings. They've become advocates within our extended family for honest communication about financial stress and have helped other relatives navigate educational funding challenges. My mother completed a financial counseling certification program and now volunteers helping other families create sustainable education funding plans. Sophia is thriving in her master's program in education, with clear financial support from our family fund and her own part-time work. But more importantly, she's pursuing her program with full knowledge of the costs and support system, making informed decisions about her academic path. Our weekly family dinners continue, though they've evolved from crisis management sessions to genuine celebrations of our individual and collective progress. We talk openly about work stress, relationship challenges, financial goals, and dreams for the future. The honesty that emerged from our crisis has become the foundation for deeper, more authentic relationships. Looking back on that Christmas dinner 2.5 years ago, I can see it as a turning point not just for my family, but for my understanding of what it means to build a meaningful life. The revelation that forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about pride, communication, and the real cost of our choices ultimately led to stronger relationships and more authentic success. As I prepare to begin my career as a family physician, I'm grateful for the circuitous path that brought me here. The detour through family crisis, financial stress, and soul-searching helped me discover not just what I wanted to do professionally, but who I wanted to be as a person and family member. The little girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor achieved that goal, but she did it as part of a family that learned to support each other with honesty, transparency, and authentic love. And perhaps most importantly, she learned that true success isn't measured by how much you can achieve on your own, but by how well you can build sustainable, supportive relationships that lift everyone up together. If you've experienced a family crisis that ultimately made your relationships stronger, I'd love to hear your story. Sometimes the most painful revelations lead to the most authentic healing. Remember to like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about family resilience and the power of honest communication, and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the foundation of genuine strength. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, the most beautiful families aren't the ones without problems, but the ones who face their problems together with courage, honesty, and love.